Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all. My name is Richard Locke. I'm a professor here at Brown in political science and international public affairs, and currently serve as the provost, and I want to thank you all for coming. For some of you, this may be the first opportunity to take part in the How Structural Racism Works series, while others, I know from just sort of seeing some of your faces, have attended at least some of the earlier lectures and workshops. And I am very thankful to Professor Tricia Rose, the director of the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, for agreeing to launch this series, which is based on her own research. Now, while this project is something that Tricia Rose has been contemplating doing for quite some time, but given the sort of significant discussions that have engaged us here at Brown and on campuses throughout the country around issues of race, racism, structural inequality, and injustice, we felt that there may be no more important time to actually begin this series than this winter and spring. And again, I'm very thankful to Professor Rose, who, while on leave, is actually doing this work, which is great. It's the Brown way. That's how we manage our budget deficit. While people are on leave, we get them to work for us. This series does what I think we are what we are best positioned to do as a university, which is to apply a scholarly lens to some of the most difficult and persistent issues that we face today as a society, so that we can better understand them, so we can engage them, so we can address them, it's my great hope, so that we can actually change these issues. And clearly we have a lot of work to do, right? As we heard last night with a terrific lecture from Professor Sandy Darity, and we've heard in previous workshops and lectures as well. There's a lot of work that needs to be done to address the different gears as well as the whole system of structural racism. But I'm convinced that as a university, we have not only a role but also a responsibility to engage in this effort. Through the research we do, through the teaching we do, through the leaders we seek to cultivate, and the events and activities we seek to sponsor and promote as a university. That's what we're about. That's the role that we can play in trying to address these issues. And if we didn't address these issues, I think it would actually be sort of irresponsible for us. We'd basically be walking away from our obligation as an institution in this society in this day and age. I would like to thank our speaker, Dr. Robert Korstad, for joining us both last night and today to discuss the role of wealth as a driver of structural racism. And many thanks again to Dr. Sandy Darity for his talk last night. And to begin this conversation, I found the conversation last night actually fantastic. As a social scientist, just sort of paying attention to the kind of research and methods and the findings from it, it was just a fantastic piece of work. So it's really terrific that we're doing this. Now let me turn it over to Sam Rosen, who is going to more formally introduce today's speaker. Thanks, Sam.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sam Rosen. I'm Brown class of 2014, and I'm currently working at CSREA for Professor Rose as the lead researcher on the How Structural Racism Works project. Thank you all so much for coming today to the second half of this two-day event on wealth and structural racism. Last night, as Provost Locke said, we had a wonderful lecture from Professor Sandy Darity, and today we have his colleague, Professor Robert Korstad, also talking about wealth and structural racism. Professor Korstad is professor at Duke in the Sanford School of Public Policy. He's also in the Department of History and the associate director of the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity. And he's also the director of the Initiative on Poverty and Social Justice. He received his BA and PhD from UNC Chapel Hill, His research interests include 20th century US history, labor history, African American history, and contemporary social policy. His publications include To Right These Wrongs, the North Carolina Fund, and the Battle to End Poverty and Inequality in 1960s America, Civil Rights Unionism, Tobacco Workers and the Struggle for Democracy in the Mid-20th Century South, Remembering Jim Crow, African Americans Talk About Life in the Segregated South, and Like a Family, The Making of a Southern Cotton Mill World. So this is a wonderful event, and please join me in welcoming Professor Robert Corstead.
Thanks, Sam and Tricia and Rich. It's a great pleasure to be here, particularly, I guess I have to get out of the way. I've got the microphone on here. So is this working? You picking this up? Okay, so good. So it's a great pleasure to be here, particularly with my colleague Sandy Darity, who's one of my favorite people on the faculty. We lured him away from my alma mater a few years ago for UNC, although we both remain strong UNC basketball fans, and so we're awaiting our game tonight. So it's a pleasure to be here to talk about this project. I discovered, I guess this fall sometime, Facebook has a lot of things that are wrong with it, but one of the things is that colleagues are always sending you examples of new things that are going on, and somebody sent me the web page or a video that Tricia had just done and said, "You've got to look at this. This looks like exactly what you're trying to do with the Cook Center." And I was totally fascinated by it and the work that's being done here, and sent it to Sandy and he said, "Well, I think I know her, so I'll get in touch and we'll see if we can start some kind of communication and some kind of engagement with people at Brown." So it's been a great opportunity for us to start thinking about this. As you can see, I'm a historian, and I've been writing for 30 years or so about the South, and particularly about issues of race and inequality in the South. And I've in the last few years have gotten a lot more interested in issues of poverty and inequality in particular, and I'm in a policy institute with a lot of social scientists who are very interested in contemporary policy and contemporary issues, but actually don't know very much about history or the background of these issues. And so I'm always, in addition, trying to educate my students, trying to educate my colleagues as well about these issues. And a few years ago, I did a book on the war on poverty with a colleague at UNC, and as we finished that book, it was on the North Carolina Fund, which was a very innovative anti-poverty program that Terry Sanford, who was the governor then and later president of Duke University, created. And when we finished that book, we decided that the book needed to do some work in the world. It wasn't enough just to put it up on the bookshelf, and so we've been trying to start developing a series of projects to try to understand contemporary policy through the lens of history, and trying to get a better perspective and understanding of that. And we've been working on, in a very concentrated way, on the two counties that our universities are located in, Durham and Orange County, which, despite having major research universities and hospitals and law schools and stuff, actually have some of the highest levels of poverty in the state. In one case, in Orange County, it's more rural poverty. In Durham, it's urban poverty. So it's a great place for us to study and to try to do some work. And we've been trying to do a variety of things, working with various activists, advocates, public service people who do social welfare services to try to get them to talking about these issues, but also trying to get them to develop some historical understanding of where these problems come from. And so this is the last year or so, I decided that that we really needed to do a very specific project to try to basically, what the title of this talk is, to peel back the layers, the kind of historical layers on contemporary challenges that we face in Durham, okay, and that are contemporary challenges that are all over the United States. And trying to take the statistics that Sandy showed, a lot of which Sandy showed us last night, and try to understand how we got to that particular place. And so it seemed to me doing some kind of a historically based project that kind of starts from the present and works back. Most historians work in a different direction. You know, they start here and they work this way. And actually, I kind of started the project like that, and as my descriptions of it and stuff didn't resonate with people very well, particularly funders. How's history important to this particular issue? Okay, yeah, so we know slavery was, you know, an issue, and Jim Crow and stuff, but these issues of structural racism and inequality, they're you know, that's old stuff. We need to know about, you know, what's going on today. And of course what they mean mostly is we need to understand individual behavior and find, you know, individual solutions to these things. And that's just not, the way it works. So I've kind of restructured my thinking to start more with where we are today, and then take this idea of really peeling back the layers. So that's what I want to talk to you today. I'll just, I'm not going to apologize, but I was trying to have a lot more of this up in a nice fancy timeline that I could show you, but this is really a work in progress, and my skills at manipulating and doing that are not, working these kind of softwares is not as good as my assistant, so, but I can talk through it in a way that I think will be really helpful. The other thing is, again, this is again a work in progress, and so I'm here really to get feedback and thoughts from you about how this resonates. How does this make sense? Are there ways in which this kind of approach, the methodology that we're trying to use here, could be more accurate, more sophisticated, whatever? Like your project on structural racism, I've kind of, and this is one of the things that resonated so quickly, is looking at particular issue areas. And so we've identified 7 areas that seem to kind of stand out when we're talking about issues of inequity or inequality in a place like Durham. The obvious ones: education, housing, municipal services, not so obvious, but an important one: politics, health, employment, criminal justice law, employment, and wealth are somewhat correlated there. And so we're trying to look at how individually each of the statistics on these particular issues, where they are, and then how we got there. And then I've started at least to think about a particular concern under each one of these categories as a way of at least starting the discussion about them. So with education, we were thinking about, you need to give people, if we're talking about issues, something concrete, something they can, put their hands around in terms of thinking about these issues. So in Durham, at least, the whole issue of the achievement gap is kind of paramount. If you look at statistics, 80% of white students in the Durham public schools are kind of prepared for college, and 25% of African American students and Hispanic students are prepared. I mean, there are all kinds of ways in which you can measure this, that this is a big issue. You look at housing and look at segregation in housing today. I mean, Durham is as racially as segregated a town as it was 50 years ago. It's more racially segregated than it was 100 years ago. Is that kind of process of what a colleague calls sorting out has taken place over time. And in fact, our cities, at least Durham, has become even more segregated. Municipal services, we could pick a lot, and I'll talk about some examples, but just street lights. If you look at, or street cleaning, or potholes. I mean, I guess they don't. Do they fill potholes in Rhode Island anymore? When I lived in Massachusetts, they didn't. So, but you know, there are whole ways in which you can probably kind of understand that just from, you know, if you live in if you're white and live in a fairly well-to-do neighborhood and your trash doesn't get picked up, you're on the phone right away, and somebody comes and picks your trash up the next day. That probably doesn't happen everywhere. Politics. In North Carolina, this is a central issue. We're really at the forefront of the battle to maintain democracy in the United States. We have a very conservative General Assembly that passed a whole series of voter restrictions over the last few years that has made, including ID laws and doing away with some early voting time. We just had a primary election a couple weeks ago, and to no one's surprise, the lines at the polling places were longer than ever been. People being questioned about the kind of ID they had, and so this whole effort to limit voting and voting participation is again another kind of central issue. Health, if you look at, I'm just picking one issue, if you look at issues of longevity and life expectancy of African Americans in Durham is much lower than from that of whites. Employment, look at the income gap, something like 5% of the population in Durham County, I think it receives something like 40 to 45% of the income, and this is not wealth, but employment. So there's and in fact, in that relationship, in that regard, Durham is one of the most unequal towns in the United States. So we have a lot of people, making large salaries, whether they're startups or not university professors, maybe medical school professors and things like that. We've got a lot of people making a lot of money, doing really well. We've got a lot of people who are living actually below the poverty line, and we've got lots of examples of really extreme poverty in Durham. And some of the in one of the census tracts, 60% of the people who should be in the labor market are not in the labor market. I mean, it's not that they're not even looking for work. So that's 60% in one census tract. Criminal justice to say New Jim Crow, and I don't know. It's hard to know where to start. But one of the places is that a study was done of Durham a few months ago. Actually, it just came out last month. In which they looked at traffic stops during the day, and of course, black men are twice as likely to be stopped for traffic violations during the day when color is obvious to the police officer, and that's just the latest in a whole series of problems. The county jail, which is mostly filled with blacks and Hispanics, there are people who've been in there 6, 7, 8 months without a trial. And they haven't been found guilty of anything. In some cases, they haven't even been charged with anything. They're not formally charged. So it's a system that's really problematic. So what I'm trying to do is to try to look back in time, to take each one of these areas and try to peel back the layers, to look at moments in the past that help create the kind of the structures, the way of thinking, the institutions that perpetuate these kinds of statistics. Okay, so they're not. None of this happened yesterday. None of it happened even in the last 10 or 20 years. We're talking about statistics that are generations, decades in the making, and I just want to give you a few examples so that we can open this up for discussion a little bit. So I guess one issue, one of the things I'm thinking about is what am I missing here? If I'm looking for additional issues or topics, these kind of things that I'm going to go really zero in on.
Local journalism and news media narrative.
Okay. I think that's exactly right. That's something until I started looking at your work, that it never really hit me. But it was, if you go back and look at the just say the daily newspaper or the local television stations. It's amazing to me. But the television station in Raleigh, which is our city capital that most people see, it's like, every day. On their website. And in their news reporting, I watch it every day. There's a picture of an African American man who's been accused of some crime. Okay, and it doesn't, it could be the most, a traffic stop or something. It doesn't matter. It's every day. They never stop. They never stop it. And if you look at the morning news report, some domestic violence issue. Somebody got. Was speeding or something like that. It's just like they continue to single that out. And that, of course, this was something that was, ubiquitous in newspapers around the South for years. So it's not surprising that most people associate black people with crime. If you go back and look at the newspapers in North Carolina, and this is, even right up through, way past the Civil Rights Movement. Not way past, but up to the Civil Rights Movement. The only time you would see pictures of African Americans in the newspaper, and I'll take the example of one city where I read 12 to 15 years of the daily newspaper, with the exception of a little column that ran once or twice a week called Negro. It started was colored news and it was Negro news. The only time you would ever see a mention or a picture of an African American was around an issue of criminal justice. So think about if that's all. If you're white or if you're black and you read the newspaper every day and that's the only representation you see, then your association with black people and crime becomes something that you just think of. It's just second nature to you. So I think that's a really good way of trying to understand how these stereotypes, because they become, institutional racism isn't just about buildings or organizations or structure. The institution of racism is right up here. Okay, it's one of the reasons why the schools themselves were segregated. Racism and the kind of stereotyping that we associate with the U.S. and particularly the South is something that had to be taught every generation. If you had people living together and going to school together and everything, that becomes much more difficult. Anybody got any other ideas about? Yeah.
What about do family demographics have an impact, particularly single-parent homes versus two-family?
Okay, so I'll just look at family demographics. Okay, we can look at how those, have changed over time. Is that a particular concern that helps explain some of these particular issues? Okay, there's another, yeah.
So thinking in terms of access to capital,
Yeah.
right? Banking, finance, and then put that in context of like exorbitant, interest rates for the poorer people.
Yeah. Okay, so wealth, and I don't know why I didn't have that up there to start with. You want to say something about it? Yeah.
So you don't have personal wealth up there,
Right.
but the municipal services is a form of public wealth.
Right.
And, we don't frequently talk about public wealth per
Right.
se. Yeah.
Okay, so that's a good example. Yeah.
The organization of civil society, what kind of organizations are there? Who's organized, who's not organized?
Okay.
Are there unions?
Yeah, and that's important. Unions, kind of associations of various sort. Yeah.
Commercial services.
Oh, okay, yeah. I mean, that's really important in Durham and in a lot of cities because of what? Urban renewal. So if you look at in Durham, if you're looking at commercial services and say black-owned businesses or the dearth of black-owned businesses in Durham right now, well, 50 years ago, there were a lot of black-owned businesses in Durham. And then urban development and the highway bills came in, really destroyed a whole black community and destroyed the large number of the businesses that were in that particular community. That's another good one to think about. Yeah, get lots of good ideas.
I'm thinking of two. One, I don't know if it's local enough, but popular culture. You talked about representation. I don't know if there's that would be local enough. And then the other one is, and I don't know how to reword this as a larger issue, but violence.
Okay. Yeah, that was I mean, this is certainly an issue that's a major concern of people right now. Particularly, I mean, there's a lot of gang violence in Durham, and there's a lot of efforts to organize around it. But if you want to trace this back into time, then we start looking at white racial violence that was necessary to create segregation, to create the system of Jim Crow. The racial violence that was used for lynching, police violence, for years as a way of maintaining that system. So as a category, violence is a kind of an interesting one to deal with because it has a lot of different facets. Yeah.
Migration?
Migration is another. I mean, this was an issue that's new. Now we have a large Hispanic population, Latino population in Durham, and that's all fairly recent. And if you look at the statistics on the Latino population, it in some cases is actually even worse than the African American population in Durham. But that's another big one. Yeah.
Under health, like the location of health centers and also licensure. So, like, for example, right now in Massachusetts, doulas are being barred from practicing through the licensure laws.
Yeah.
So, like, the privileging, making it accessible, like legal practices.
Right. Okay. Yeah. So the whole location of healthcare. I like this whole thing about the licensure and other issues there. Yeah.
Also under health, environmental determinants of health, and how that's explicitly linked to things like municipal services.
Yeah. Yeah. So here's a good example of that. I'm trying to work some of these. When Durham was established, it was actually established as a city in 1869, but the population growth was really pretty much late 19th century. All of the white families, the kind of elite white families that were building the factories and the stores and shops in town, located their homes on the kind of high ground in Durham. And all the African American, their numbers, so there's a kind of, if you've got high ground, then you've got something going down to it. Well, those are all kind of river beds or creek beds or places where water runs from the high ground down. And not surprisingly, all of the African American communities are in those areas that run down. Before really good sewer systems and water systems, I mean that's where the white people's sewage ran down through the black neighborhoods. And actually, Durham was not as bad as some places in North Carolina and other places in the South, but that's a good example. And to some extent, it's the same issue. It's still an issue today. Okay, so I think that this is great. These are some new ideas for me to think about. So let me give you some examples, and I'll give you some kind of stark ones. I'll give you one that Sam really likes. So, in 1930. The White Women's Garden Club in Durham decided that the city needed to have a tree planting campaign. This must have been in vogue in the U.S. at that point. But the idea was that neighborhoods with tree canopies were kind of healthier, more attractive. It helped with land values and also just the kind of comfort and the beauty of the neighborhood. So it was about money and beautification. So the city, they went to the city and said, you know, we think we'd like you to take on this tree planting campaign. And I had a graduate student a couple years ago found this map just rummaging around in the county manager's office. And so what they did, so they planted thousands of trees, and these are big, beautiful oaks, live oaks, and things that are in the city right now. They planted those, and if you look, and so we have the map of each block and how many trees were planted in each block, and we've got these little red lines for some reason. And it turns out every one of those, every block where the trees were planted were probably someplace where one of the women's garden club members lived. So the neighborhoods that got these trees, that got this canopy, were upper middle class white neighborhoods. Okay? There were no trees planted in the white working class neighborhoods, most of which were at that point mill villages for the textile and hosiery industry. There were no trees planted in any of the African American communities, although Durham had one of the largest and wealthiest black middle classes in the country in 1930. And what's really interesting is that the map for the tree planting tracks perfectly with the redlining map that was created by the federal government 3, 4, 7 years later in 1937 as a way of limiting or defining where loans could be made for housing loans. If you realize that homes and neighborhoods are the kind of prime place people accumulate wealth, and this tree planting in fact did its job of creating these very attractive neighborhoods, you get some understanding between how the spending on those trees advantaged some people, and this is one of the things that's really important about the work that we're doing. We're not just looking at how people are disadvantaged by all of these different issues, particularly municipal services, but how people are advantaged. Because I think that's one of the hardest things for people to get their minds around, is appreciating and understanding how they are privileged. It's the hardest thing for my students to get their mind around. That somehow they think that, I made it to the top on my own. And without understanding and appreciating all the different ways, including the planting of trees in your neighborhood, 70, 80 years ago, 85 years ago now, what's happened. This is important for public policy today, and why it's so intriguing, because now these trees are 80 some years old and they're starting to die. And so the town has realized that they have to develop a new tree planting program. Okay, so the city council's already begun to work out a project for that, and they do have a clause in there that this needs to be, a planning program that doesn't exclude certain neighborhoods. Okay, so they're at least somewhat sensitive to that, but being able to go in and talk to them and have that plan drawn up in a way that takes, it understands and appreciates this long past is going to be really important. Now, one of the problems with this, I started driving around Durham to see, well, what it's going to look like if we plant all these trees in these traditionally African American communities. Well, one of the problems is there's no place to plant the trees because they put the sidewalks so close to the street to the extent that they've got. Now, the people who are actually going to benefit are probably people who don't have sidewalks. Well, that's not good. But if you've got the sidewalks are so close to the street, there's no place to plant these trees. That doesn't mean that there are not trees around. People planted trees in their yards, and the town now will come and, if it's on a particular corner or something, and do that. The point is that here's something that seems pretty innocuous, right? We planted some trees in 1930. And what we're in the process of doing is trying to is we'll start doing some evaluation of increases in property values over time to get some, we'll pick a couple different streets. And we're out, I've got a research associate now who's has been working on gentrification. So we can do that. We can actually go out and pick these neighborhoods and get some sense of how the housing prices or land values have appreciated over time. One neighborhood that got the trees and another neighborhood that didn't get the trees. Here's another example, I'll give you a few more, about the way in which wages or low wages have impacted people. So in 1920 something, I forget, right after World War II, if you look at the wage that black women stemmery workers made working in the tobacco factories. So stemming is a process the kind of first process of taking and peeling the leaf, the stem away from the leaf before the tobacco leaves. It wasn't mechanized until after World War II, so this was a really nasty, dirty job, and women would grow like long fingernails, not real long, but long enough so that they could use them like a knife to cut through those things. If you look at the wages of an average a stemmery worker at that time, I forgot what it was exactly the word, but it translates into about $2.50 in today's dollars.
Wow.
Okay, so never mind minimum wage. So that's a third of minimum wage. It's, if we're talking about $15 an hour. So this is a process that goes on over a long period of time, and you understand, kind of where wealth inequality comes from, lack of investment in housing, and you also understand where all the wealth came from that created a place like Duke University, which came from tobacco and textiles and eventually electricity. So you're looking at a system and a history in which great wealth created great poverty. And it's important for people to understand that that these things kind of go hand in hand. They're not separated from each other. So trying to get my students to understand that the great wealth that created and continues to finance the education that you're getting, even though they're spending $50,000 a year, they don't understand, but that's about half of what they actually get spent on them. I don't know if that's true at Brown, right? I mean, despite the high tuition, we pretty much double in terms of what we spend per student. And that comes from endowment mostly, or new endowment, but a lot of it comes from old endowment. So people say, well, I never had any part of this. Why is affirmative action or reparations or any of these kinds of things you're talking about important? I said, you're still benefiting from this in very direct ways. So that's something that you need to understand. Segregation change track a little bit. So these are ways that we can go back and we can look at all the different ways people were advantaged and disadvantaged by public policy and private action. And then the thing is to start, and I'm trying to start thinking about how you create this matrix and how you create the software that allows you to show that. So how do you start having these things relate to one another? Okay, so how does obviously the trees relates to housing and to wealth and maybe some other issues. There's actually some studies now that show that children who grow up on a tree-lined street suffer from a lot less anxiety and stress and other things like that. I mean, so that there's all kind of ramifications for this. So I'm interested in the kind of interaction of all of these things, because we know that any one of these issues, if you say, okay, education is the answer to inequality. Well, Sandy showed last night, well, that's not actually the case. There's a lot of, if you control for education, that's still there. And we know that, that housing and health are correlated in all kind of different ways. So you can't solve the health problem, or you can't solve the education problem in those schools without dealing with the wages of parents, or the housing conditions, or the transportation system in town that gets students back and forth. So we know that these things today, these things interact in all these important ways. And so the trick, and this is something that historians are sometimes good at and sometimes not so good at, is going back in the past and understanding all the interactions and the relationships between these various factors over time. Now, another thing that I want to talk about, and then we can start having some questions and stuff, is this isn't the whole story isn't just the creation of inequities. There's a whole nother story here, which is about the way in which people have fought against those inequities, or the creation of those equities over time, and how that might help us think about designing the policies to deal with these today. So I'll give you one example. Well, I'll give you multiple examples, but I'll start with one. So in the 1960s in Durham, and this is part of this War on Poverty project that I did, Durham was one of the few towns in the United States that during the whole period of the middle 60s didn't have urban unrest. Okay? And after Martin Luther King was killed, I can remember sitting on my dorm in Chapel Hill and watching the fires in Raleigh. But in Durham, there was nothing like that. And the reason there was nothing like that is there was an anti-poverty organization that had been doing grassroots organizing and community organizing for 4 or 5 years by that point, and had developed a political organization of mostly African American women, but men too, and they had begun to change some of the power relations in the city itself. So when the leaders and the community organizers approached the young people who may or may not have been thinking that violence of some sort was a reaction, these young people, they were able to talk to them and say, we've got an organization here, we've got a level of engagement, and we're making changes here that you don't want to just destroy overnight with doing something that's not appropriate. So one of the things that we've been thinking, so the community organizers and community organizing was one of the most effective, probably the most effective anti-poverty strategy or tactic in Durham in the 1960s. Now, if you look on, despite we have a community organizer as president, if you look on anybody or any foundation or any institution's agenda of how to deal with inequality in the United States today, my guess is that hire a bunch of community organizers is not on their list, right? I mean, I don't know, Sandy, if we were going to be able to convince foundations and funders that the way that we really need to address these issues in communities is to go out and hire a bunch of community organizers who then train and work with people in the community to become organizers themselves. But yet that's probably one of the most important lessons, and the thing that I think probably did the most to address some of these structural inequalities in Durham was the mobilization and the organization of low-income communities. So why isn't that at the top of most people's agenda when they're talking about how do we deal with issues of inequality? How do we deal with issues of poverty in the United States today? Everything is about changing individual behavior. Very little of it looks at these larger issues. A couple other things that are important here is that, say, in the realm of politics, starting in the 1930s, this group of fairly wealthy African Americans, and it was through the North Carolina Mutual Life Insurance Company and banking and a few other ways in which they were able to again, it gets back to this whole issue of commercial services. Segregation provided an opportunity for enterprising blacks in Durham to create an insurance company, which was, I think at the time, the largest black-owned company in the world, because white insurance companies didn't want to provide burial insurance or other kinds of insurance policies for black people. So one of the things, they began in the 1930s to organize politically and start going down and registering to vote, and sometimes they were able to do that, sometimes not. But they had a political organization that began years, and this is 30 years before the Civil Rights Movement, 30 years before the Voting Rights Campaign. So there's lessons there. Another important lesson, which is on some people's agenda in terms of how to deal with inequality, was the development of labor unions in Durham. So in the 1930s, in the tobacco industry particularly, the Tobacco Workers Union were able to organize initially whites. This was a segregated workforce and segregated in departments. They organized the whites. Eventually they organized and got labor contracts for the blacks, and even though these were Jim Crow unions, they weren't ideal by any means, and people were trying to break down some of those divisions. Those union contracts and the better benefits and the higher wages they got contributed to some of the stability and upward mobility for certain people in Durham. So there's another example of how historically people had organized and mobilized to try to challenge these larger forces that were creating these kinds of inequalities. So I think that one of the most important lessons of this for me is to begin looking not only at the way inequality is created, but understanding, appreciating, and documenting and valorizing all the different ways in which people have fought against that. It's particularly useful for young people today. So the Fight for 15. I mean, we've got a really good group of young people, fast food workers, healthcare workers in Durham and in other places in North Carolina and around the country too, who are trying to organize. They're trying to get higher wages, and they, in a lot of cases, think that they're operating in a historical vacuum. That that nobody else has done that before. That this is such a hard job that it's very difficult to do, and you can get very pessimistic about it. And then, but if you go back and look, and this is not in Durham, but in Winston-Salem, where another one of my studies on tobacco workers and women tobacco workers, you've got the organization in the 1940s by mostly black women at R.J. Reynolds Tobacco Company, which was at that point known as the Ford of the South. That was because it was the most anti-union company in the South, and it resisted unionization for a long period of time. These workers, starting with a fairly small group, were able to begin an organizing process, and then when a particular event happened in the factory, they were able to utilize the networks and the kind of social capital and the social learning that had been going on to organize a union, a sit-down strike, and eventually a union that brought incredible benefits to African American and white workers in Durham too. And this was in the heart of Jim Crow. And so when you talk to young people and said, look, it is hard today. I'm not saying that unionization rates are low. You don't have support of big national organizations. But look back at this particular moment in time and appreciate what it took for those people to do what you're trying to do now. And so I think that the history of this resistance, the effort to control people's own lives and their environments is really important for an understanding of how we address some of these issues. So why don't I stop and we have some questions and discussions. Thank you. I hope I didn't talk too slow for an interview. It's an occupational, no, it's a geographical hazard. Yes. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I came in about 10 minutes late, and maybe you covered this, but I'm very curious. The kind of work you do requires a cool head, as far as I'm concerned. And I can't believe that you got into this line of work without there being some fire in your belly. And I can't believe that there isn't some fire in your belly now. So my question is, or my request is, give me an anecdote or give me a remembrance where you're fighting within yourself to stay cool so that what you truly believe in can be fed, can be effective in our society today.
Stay cool. Oh, that's not my strong suit.
Well, excellent. Thank you. That's what I'm talking about. So, yeah.
No, I mean, I think that as I grew up in North Carolina. My father was after he got out of the Army and decided not to go back to graduate school, became a labor organizer in the South. And so I grew up in a family that was, kind of a left-leaning family that was very progressive on civil rights issues. But for a whole variety of reasons, my parents started a landscape nursery, which my mother's father had one in Charleston, South Carolina. So I grew up in a very middle class, going totally to white schools, learning one thing at home and seeing another thing. Living Jim Crow and fighting in the household fighting Jim Crow, or listening to people fight Jim Crow, and that I think that tension is what drives all of this today, because it's you witness so many examples of this. I'll give you a good example, I think, about one incident that did this. So this was the first McDonald's opened in Greensboro in 1960. So I was 12 then. So I was working with my father had a landscape business. So he had a truck, and my father, and the African American man who had been the president of the union in Winston-Salem that I was talking about, and was blacklisted all over North Carolina, so he couldn't get a job. So he and my father had a truck, and they did landscape work for a long period of time. So I was working on the truck one day with Chip, who was working with my father. So we had to stop for lunch someplace. We hadn't brought our lunch. So we pull in. He said, "Where do you want to go?" And I said, "Well, I've heard there's this new McDonald's. I really like to go there." And so we pull into the parking lot, and I get out of the truck, and he hands me some money and some hamburgers, 15 cents. So he probably handed me $1 and give me a couple, I said, "Well, why aren't you going?" I mean, why aren't you coming with me? I mean, I was 12. He said, "Well, they don't serve me here." And I was looked at it and I was astonished. I knew what Jim Crow was, but I was like, "What do you mean they don't serve you there?" He said, "McDonald's, they don't serve black people." And I don't think I've done a lot of embarrassing things in my life, but I don't think I've ever felt my stomach fall quite as low as I did that particular day. So I think you're right. I think they're yeah. I'll come back up here.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, we do need to use the mic because we're filming this.
Oh, okay. Could you talk a little bit about the example that you gave about the trees versus the example about the tobacco leaves, and even the example you just gave right now? Seems to me they kind of fall into sins of omission versus sins of commission,
Uh-huh.
or some way of talking about the unconscious, things that people just don't think of.
Uh-huh.
Can you talk a little bit about how to fight that? I mean, if presumably this group of women didn't think about it,
Right.
and that goes on all the time, everywhere, and how we fight that as opposed to the more on the
Yeah.
surface.
Well, I think the way in which inequality and racism gets normalized in society is one of the greatest, at least in the South, has been one of the greatest challenges we face. And this is it's a complicated story, but I think it gets normalized in these structures. Okay, so just structures of behavior, structures of thinking. You take it for granted that this school is a black school and this school is a white school, or you take it for granted that that's a black entrance and that's a white entrance, and people you just respond in the same way, so I think it's challenging as you go back to try to think about what prompted these particular kinds of actions and stuff. And I think you're right. I mean, the trees, I don't think those women thought about what they were doing. Okay? I think there's some other things. Disfranchisement, those people knew exactly what they were doing. That was a very concerted effort to try to keep people from voting.
Right. Actually, I just wanted to add one thing to this because I think this is a really interesting point. But they often work together perfectly. So the tree-lined decisions were then mirrored. Bob didn't go into it, but the redlining was a government's strategic then institutionalization of what was an unconscious practice that was already institutionalized prior to the unconscious practice. So it's structure, you can chicken or egg it forever, but in this case we can say structure, consciousness, more structure, more consciousness, more structure. But so I guess what I'm saying is that at once they were both potentially unconscious but also structured. That the split may not quite be a productive way to think about it because they're actually reciprocally constructing each other.
Yeah, that's a really good example of that. Yeah. Yes. You've had your hand up for a long time. Oh, you don't have the microphone on. No.
Yeah, so under the health category, I was wondering if you knew anything about the existence of grocery gaps or sort of the access to grocery stores, and then within even those grocery stores, maybe perhaps the pricing and how minorities can maybe even afford healthy foods.
Right. Yeah, okay, that's a big issue. Durham has a good number of food deserts, and whole neighborhoods that have access to no grocery stores. They don't even have fast food, not fast food or convenience stores where you can get things. So that's a big issue that people were trying to address. And that again is another complicated story about the way in which this whole issue of commercial services and traditional black businesses and stuff were destroyed at one particular time. Also, the lack of credit for people to start stores like that, and the lack of wealth in those communities, perhaps in some communities, to actually support that. So I think it's and there are ways in which this is tied into kind of municipal services too, where people are thinking about that. There's a lot of effort right now in any of the new and somebody was talking about this last night. I guess about in Toronto, if you're building a new public housing unit, yeah, right. You have to create a grocery store. You have to have these other kinds of things where there's not much thinking about that. And again, there's not a lot of it gets back to the whole issue about where the health clinics are. People didn't think about those particular things, and I think it's still. You're right. It's still a big concern.
Can we go over here?
Yes, over here. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's I think very clear that you developed a big interest in Durham and developed really deep roots. And I also really appreciated you talking about the challenges in educating your students about Durham and helping them learn more about not only where they're from, or where they are, I should say, but also the privileges that allow them to be where they are. Brown's really interested in this concept around engaged scholarship. It's a curricular innovation around community-based learning, all this stuff that I have qualms about, I think, for many of the reasons that you specified. That deep learning that helps students think about where they are and how what they are was how where they are was created is something that I don't know if the university is quite positioned to answer and help through that process. So do you have any advice for Brown as it considers that curricular change, and if that's happening at Duke, how your work might inform that change?
Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing I do most of the time at Duke. I've been very involved in, civic engagement and community-based research and stuff for years, and it drives a lot of the research that I do, but it's also an important part of my teaching. I think you have to be very intentional about the way in which you prepare students to do that. We've had to move from this service model, where people are out, they think if they go to the school, do tutoring and stuff, then that's fine. They've kind of satisfied their need for giving something back. And there are a lot of problems with that. The most important of which is that rarely do they ask, well, why in the world would that student or that school need me to come over and tutor? I mean, what is it about the educational system or the resources, how we resources our schools, that some white kid from New Jersey, who can barely get off campus except to go to a bar or a restaurant, why is it that they would do that? So, I mean, one of the things that we're doing increasingly in the programs that I'm involved in, and we've got an umbrella group now that's really pushing this for all these groups, is to get students to understand, where those inequalities come from that might necessitate or require a need for them. Why there's not enough resources in the school. Then the other thing we're trying to do then is get them, okay, you need to go vote. If you really feel strongly about these things, you need to be voting for school board members, or at least going and attending some of the school board meetings and stuff. And your role as a civic participant in this community needs to be broader than just going down and doing some tutoring. And to the extent that you can, I bring it into my classroom. I think that we have a number of programs that are, where they're tied to internships and stuff, where people are trying to go through and do this ahead of time. I'm teaching a class right now on inequality in the United States, and I'm having the students, they're not doing service, but I'm having them do a kind of a mini research project on inequality in Durham. And so they're taking all these different categories. I gave them a list of things. So they have to get off campus, they have to interview, they have to go down to the local library, they have to do things to get a better understanding, appreciation of the place that they live and how some of these inequalities got created in the first place.
I have a question, but first I want to point out that they're pretty exceptional at Duke in this regard. I mean, you guys are doing.
You've got a
great unit in operation, but I wouldn't say that focus on inequality is a hallmark of the entire curriculum.
No.
Okay, just wanted to get clear.
Right. No.
Put it in context. But I have a question about integration and the ending of Jim Crow. I mean, our general public narrative is that, of course, Jim Crow was horrible and that its ending was somehow a good thing. There's many good things about the ending of Jim Crow, but it seems to me an argument could be made, and it has been made in other circles, I'm just wondering what your opinion is, that many of the kinds of destruction of black communities took place after integration.
Right.
And that is to say that while there was depreciation and depletion and disaggregation of resources during Jim Crow,
right,
you also had black communities figuring out how to survive under those conditions without the constant destruction of even their own infrastructure. So black businesses, black grocery stores, while decimated economically under Jim Crow, aren't necessarily worse than what happens after Jim Crow.
Right.
So can you speak to that moment? If you're starting 1869
right,
coming forward, is there a critical point that the ending of Jim Crow tells us about a new set of relationships?
Yeah, I think, and I'll even go back a little further than that, because this is something that Sandy was talking about last night about this whole process of black land loss over the course of 100 years or so. I think that's a really critical one. I mean, one of the things in the wake of the civil rights movement and the eventual desegregation of the schools, and this has been written about a lot, was the kind of the loss of a lot of the jobs, you know, as principals, as vice principals, as school teachers, as advisors in those black schools. And so that was a loss of you know, pretty stable middle class, lower middle class incomes from people. As you know, new requirements were put in, new educational levels were, you know, required for teachers. There was a good bit of that. You know, people, now that they could shop in white stores that had a much wider range of things for them to buy, quit going to the corner store that had only a limited range of stuff that was owned by you know, somebody in the African American community. So I think that there are a lot of different ways in which the kind of end of Jim Crow, it was done in a kind of unself-conscious is one. It wasn't planned and thought out in any particular. We just thought if we could end some of the laws and we could end some of the practices, and then everything would be fine. Everybody would be
The assumption was full integration.
right. And
right.
yeah, and so
That it would
right.
somehow, right. There wouldn't be continued discrimination under
Right.
the guise of you know, equality.
Right, yeah. And see, I think part of the problem there is I don't think people in the civil rights movement, and I don't think a lot of people, understood the complexity and the multidimensionality of what Jim Crow was. Because it wasn't, for me, it wasn't just looking back at this, it wasn't just a system of racial discrimination. It was a way of ordering a whole society, and a way of ordering whites and placing whites as well as blacks, and creating a lot of different structures that, you know, people didn't even think about the need to address in the process of that something was going to be required. And in a sense, you know, we did a better job in Reconstruction. At least people thought, well, the government needs to come in and do something. We did a little bit of that with the Voting Rights Act and enforcement, but now we've even done away with that. So the safeguards that would have prevented some of what you're talking about just weren't put in place.
I have a question over here. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. My fault.
So I have a question. I'm a historian, so I'm in the history department here.
Yeah.
And I noticed that you're also a professor of public policy.
Right.
And I'm very intrigued by this idea that you're making history matter to maybe funders. And I was wondering to what degree you've been successful of going from the present to the past and how that, you know, that's worked perhaps. And also whether or not you have any advice for us plain old historians who aren't professors also of public policies.
Well, success in convincing people. I would say some pretty limited. I mean, if you look, I've been for years trying, there are 2 or 3 big research centers for poverty in the United States. One at Michigan, one at Wisconsin, there's one at a couple other places now. And I've been writing grant proposals, a letter of inquiries for 15 years now, trying to see if I could apply for grants or research funds or you know, to study the history of poverty and the fight against poverty. I've never gotten, you know, I've never gotten any kind of support, and rarely do I even get a response to my inquiries. Because everything, all the research, everything is done looking at individuals and individual behavior. I mean, sometimes they look at larger structures, but it's in a pretty ahistorical way. So I've been fairly frustrated in that. You know, I think that I think that one of the things that I do in public policy is try to, and I'm lucky that I've got a number of colleagues who I think have a good understanding and appreciation of history, but of really being able to take examples and use case studies, and that's one of the things I've been trying to do and that we'll try to do out of here. I mean, I can think of a nice little 5-page thing on the trees with graphs and, you know, with some maps and things like that that could be used to talk to people about the impact of, you know, municipal policy. But I think that, you know, I think it's hard. I think it's difficult for people trained in the social sciences to appreciate the kinds of ways that, and the kind of work that historians do, and the way they analyze, the way they gather materials, the way they use archives and stuff. It seems kind of arcane to them. I don't know. I wish I could be more positive about that, but I think, you know, this is one of the things that we've been talking with Tricia about. Is I think as historically minded kind of policy people, we have to figure out new and different ways of communicating with people and sharing this information. You know, the monographs that I've written, again, it's where I started today, saying I wanted the work on poverty to do some work in the world. I think we have to find different ways of doing that. That was a 450-page book. Well, you know, there are not that many people. I mean, a lot of people read it, but not enough that could, you know, that you could, that it's going to mobilize enough people to do those kinds of things. So I think that using new technologies, new forms of media and stuff is a way of educating and engaging with people around these issues is really important. And I think historians need to learn how to do that better.
Do you know where we can get training to do that?
Well, I think pretty soon you've got a good thing going here at Brown. I mean, I think this center is, you know, is at least thinking and already beginning to do some experimentation with that. I don't have any good examples. Let me think about it, and I'll send you a note.
Okay.
Any more questions?
Hi, my question is sort of a spatial corollary to Dr. Rose's question, but I was interested in this idea of, so Durham's sort of being built on this plantation economy, and then this transition to urbanization and this consolidation of supposedly freed Black folks, but it was really a consolidation of poverty and like taking away resources. That sort of persisted in these inequalities that we see now. And I was wondering what you thought about this spatial shift from people being enslaved on plantations and supporting this plantation economy into this sort of urbanized space in which like resources are taken from them. What do you think sort of has persisted in terms of like this economic shift? And what you think how has that conversation changed as like where like Black folks are sort of trapped has changed?
I think that, well, the initial transition into urban areas was, I think it was pretty tough on people, and it took away a lot of the, well, I mean, on the one hand, you know, they escaped some of the racial violence of the countryside and some of the poverty of the countryside, and they, you know, were able to get somewhat better paying jobs and a regular income. I mean, people in Winston-Salem, they talk about coming to Winston-Salem in the 19-teens and 1920s to work in those factories, and felt like, you know, this is a city where literally the streets are paved with gold, in that case, gold tobacco leaves. But so I think that there was there were some benefits from that. You know, I don't think the interesting things is I don't think things have changed. I mean, that process has just continued. Okay, so it's not. I mean, and people moved out of the South into the North and continued to look for those kinds of jobs just at the time when the economy was going in the opposite direction with automation and a lot of other things. You've had a lot of Black migration back to the South, and mostly it's been retired people, I think, moving into small towns where their homes were, their families and stuff are. There's been some of that in local areas. I mean, in urban areas. But by and large, people are kind of trapped there. And in Durham, you know, they don't work in the tobacco factory now. They work at Duke Hospital. You know, is CPAs, is that CNAs, certified nursing assistants, yeah, or maintenance staff at Duke. I mean, Duke has always had, you know, all the housekeeping staff, virtually all of the food service workers are African American. They have been since the university was created. That hasn't, some of those kinds of things haven't changed. I don't know if that answers your question, but it's a state. Yeah. Yeah.
I think this is a fantastic study, and one of the things I think that's great about it is that you're looking across domains and how they interact in place, which policy studies just usually look at a single policy.
Right.
The one thing that I would say that might be interesting to do is, you know, as you talked about this, the focus is local, but a lot of, especially on a lot of what allows challenges are changes in policy from above that might help open space. And of course, that's what the War on Poverty did, but it might be interesting to have layers of what is happening at the federal level and at the state level that's either, you know, reinforcing structural racism or is kind of opening up space for local activists to do challenges.
Yeah. Okay, I think that's a really good point, and one that I kind of missed here from the back of my head and didn't get to the front of my head. No, that's exactly right. I mean, here's the perfect, you know, this voting rights issue that we're facing right now. That's not something, it's being enforced locally, but it's not something that was generated locally. And I think the same thing is true of you know, various other issues here, where it's around voting rights and war on poverty, education. In North Carolina right now, one of the big challenges is the General Assembly has done something that the white supremacists did in the late 19th century, which is really restrict local control over all kinds of issues. We had 2 days ago, the General Assembly in North Carolina came back and passed a anti-discrimination bill that overrode a local decision that was made in Charlotte to allow transgender people to be able to choose the restroom that they went in. And now they've created a you know, an anti-discrimination bill that doesn't include LGBT rights. You know, and they've done away with all the kinds of safeguards that some different communities have been making, and they're doing that on a lot of different areas. So the tensions between the local and the state are an important thing. I think that's something that's got to get embedded in here better. Yeah. Oh, one more question.
No, not me.
Oh. Anybody else got a question or a thought? Or here's your mic's coming this way.
Yeah, earlier in the talk, you raised the question of what it is that holds all of these strands, factors together. But you kind of dropped it.
Yeah.
You know, as I was listening, the thing that came to my mind is the management of the process of capital accumulation.
Mm-hmm.
That if we look at the cycles, the ups and downs here, that why do we have slavery? Why do we have segregation, right? This was the role that African Americans played in the process of capital accumulation.
Right.
At the end of slavery, right? You get rid of slavery, and there's an adjustment in the process of capital accumulation. So that, to me, this is where, you know, in America, you don't let the market organize the society, and that conscious political action is taken. Now, you said that at the end of Jim Crow, what we didn't do was plan, right? So you end Jim Crow, and you say, well, to African Americans, well, you know, just find your way in this market society. go out, respond to the market signals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so African Americans have been floundering around, trying to respond to these market signals, et cetera, et cetera. But when you compare that now to the recent crisis, the collapse in 2008, we're not seeing, well, okay, let all of these big banks respond to the market signals. You know, we came up with literally trillions of dollars, planning, talk, quantitative easing, all of this stuff. So, you know, to me, it's the management of capital and the conditions of its management that really organizes all of these things. The way in which capital accumulation is managed at the moment, there's actually either a need for black communities to be sidelined and ghettoized the way they are, or just simply ignored. You see? And so we really have to talk about how the liberation of African Americans, how the ending of racism, right, is going to really, really affect or even be integrated into this process of capital accumulation.
Yeah, but I think that's a really good question. I think this whole, I mean, one of the things I've been trying to do in thinking about Jim Crow is to make an argument of, you know, is kind of look at the political economy of Jim Crow. This is a social structure in which issues of wealth and power and control and capitalist development are critical. Here's one way where I think the end of white supremacy, perhaps, or racism, if you want to say that. There's I don't know if a great book that came out about a year ago by Barbara and Karen Fields called Racecraft, the soul of inequality in the United States. And, you know, basically it's looking at things, you know, about the kind of creation of race as a category to both rationalize and justify slavery, but also to create differences between poor whites and poor blacks as a way of providing some stability in the society. And it seems to me that, you know, that has been, you know, the linchpin of American society and American capitalism since the 1600s. And one of the questions for me is, you know, once that, if that were to go away, or if you could kind of work past that, if we could deal with this issue of white supremacy and racism, you know, what does that mean in terms of building the kinds of biracial or the kind of multiracial, multi-ethnic coalitions that are necessary to challenge for political power in a different way? And so this whole story and the whole challenge of doing that, of ending racism, seems to me to require a engagement with American history right from its beginning, and understand the role that what racism and white supremacy plays in holding the structure up right from the beginning. I don't know. I mean, I think it's you know, you can look at. I mean, Brown is doing a really good job trying to, you know, understand the links between slavery and capital accumulation in the North. And I think, you know, my students, when we were reading it this spring, were kind of horrified to learn that actually a substantial part of the profits from slavery ended up in northern banks and not in the South. You know, so we were shipping our money away even then. That's a simple answer to a really good question. But thank you all for coming and